Welcome, everyone. My name is Eleanor Hunter, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this 6th of the information sessions that the Oak Lodge Governance Project has presented. Today, we'll be talking about Water Utilities 101. And before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone that since March, the Oak Lodge Governance Project has been holding these information sessions on the second Saturday of the month. This month, September, the day happens to land on September 11th, and it's the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And we would be remiss to not take a moment of silence to remember those who have been lost in this time. So if we'll everybody could just put your feet flat on the floor for a moment, and we can just take a few deep breaths together. Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to introduce Jane Civiletti, who is another one of our steering committee members, who will introduce today's speaker. Jane?
Thank you, Eleanor. Well, some time ago, Mitra, another steering committee member, and I were discussing future information sessions. She mentioned that her dad had worked for the Portland Water Bureau, and having worked for decades in a lab which did biological testing for that bureau, and knowing some of their employees, I asked his name. Mitra said his name is Morteza Anoushiravani, but he just goes by Mort. I nearly dropped the phone. I said, Mort, your dad is Mort? We decided then that it was a good idea for us to ask him if he would like to do one of our sessions. Since his employment with the city of Portland, he's transitioned into working worldwide for Mercy Corps. He's the director of infrastructure there. Today, perhaps he'll draw us closer to home, discussing the importance of functional water systems to municipalities. I give you Mort.
Thank you very much for that, Jane. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm actually looking forward to it. I got up at 3 in the morning, remembering I had a couple of typos on my presentation. So that just shows how excited I'm about sharing some thoughts and some of my experience. And I want this to be actually a dialogue rather than a monologue. So as I am sharing my presentation, if there are questions, please stop me and we can go there, because I just want to make sure I'm sharing information that's useful to the group. And also, I just want to say a couple of words about 9/11. I'm glad we had that remembrance. My son is actually in New York, along with 11 of his colleagues who work for Lake Oswego Fire Department, to remember and honor those that we lost on that awful day. The other thing I just want to also mention is to applaud the community's efforts to have these kind of issues and sessions to basically educate themselves and also the community as you look at these serious issues and important issues for the community. It's basically evidence-based and data-based, and it's not just by intuition or things like that, because there is nothing about water utility that is by intuition. It's totally data-driven, it's complex, and it's very important to understand and appreciate the complexities and the nuances that have that these utilities have. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And then again, this is just very general. So please ask questions and stop me. And the success of my basically presentation is if I can share my screen. So here we go, see if I'm successful. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Perfect. That looks
Okay.
great.
All right, thank you very much. So like I said, stop me, and I'm hoping somebody's moderating the chat box, or you can just interrupt me, please. Okay, the outline that I want to share with you information-wise, so you know what's coming in terms of your questions and expectations, is I'll share some general water utilities characteristics, the governance of utilities, what are the major components of a water utility, what type of or variety of water utilities there are, what are the rates, how they are calculated, what they are based on, and what do they mean. And also another important issue that all utilities deal with is the capital versus the O&M, and also some information about capital programs. Now, some of the things that I'm talking about, it's common to other utilities also, whether it would be sewer, whether it would be even electricity, power, that is common to those organizations also. So what are some of the characteristics of water utilities? First of all, they are essentially monopolies because they provide an essential service that that a portion of a community or rely on it, that they need it, and there is no competition for that service, if you will. So that gives them certain advantages, and then there are also certain accountabilities that goes with that. Also, utilities are not general tax supported. They are supported by their own rates, and I have the revenue there, and revenue is if in case they had some other areas that they generate revenue, or for example, if they have a piece of land that they're leasing it and they collect some rent. Just for completeness, I included that, but that's not a major part of their basically revenue stream. It's rate. The other thing about water utilities is they are highly regulated by federal law, state laws, local laws, environmental laws, public health, labor laws, finance and fiduciary, and all of that. So it's a very complex environment to operate in, to make sure they are in compliance with all these different regulation and laws. They are extremely capital intensive. If you think about it, all the basically the infrastructure it takes to make a water utility of any size, it's very expensive to build, to maintain, to operate. The other thing is water utilities are essentially very durable, and it's not unusual. You have a lot of, especially larger water utilities that are in operation for their second century, if you will. And then also, one of the other element that's very important for water utilities is the long-term planning that they have to do, and making sure at any given time they can provide the service to their customers. And the customers are obviously the residents, commercial, institutional, customers. The other thing that's also important to recognize that maybe I forgot to mention at the beginning, every water utility is unique. It's almost like a fingerprint, because it's not just their infrastructure, their customer base, their sources, and all of that. So you have to be really careful when you look at different water utilities to fully understand those components of it. The other characteristics is water utilities have relatively high fixed costs. And the simple example I use that is when you are operating a treatment plant. If you produce 20 million gallons a day or 30 million gallons a day, you still need to have 1 or 2 operators on shift. So therefore, those kind of costs are fixed, And the variable costs are like the chemical costs or the power costs and all of that. Generally, those are less of an issue, if you will. The other thing with water utilities is they are very adaptive to new regulations because there are constantly new regulations come online, and you have to be responsive to that and make your operation or your design and all of that to change. In fact, I look back in my own career, I look at the type of the regulation, the complexity of the regulation, even the technology has changed tremendously, and all water utilities have to respond to that. The other is also that makes them more adaptive and responsive, if you will, are the customer demands and expectation in terms of the service, in terms of the quality, in terms of the performance. And not surprisingly, I was wondering whether I should even put that in there or not, but generally all water utilities are under some sort of a political pressure. And one of the major reasons for that is once you have a piece of land, the other thing that would allow you to develop, if you will, is the availability of water. So therefore, there's a lot of pressure and issues around the planning and making sure there is water available. So that brings in basic political pressure. In fact, I was thinking back, you look at the first water commission or committee that was set up in Portland over 100 years ago. Most of the people on that committee were the major developers of the city, Ladd, Pettigrove. So there is that very direct and important connection there. The governance of water utilities. All water utilities, whether private or public, have at some point and level have public accountability. Whether if it's a municipality, it's a city council, or if it's a county commission, if it's a treatment plant, or their water boards or board of directors. So at the end of the day, no matter how they are structured, what form they have, there is a public accountability as a part of their governance. Then the components of a water utility. Then again, these are big buckets, if you will, just to sort of understand, follow the water, if you will. The first one, and maybe one of the most important one, are the water rights. Whether you have groundwater or surface water, which are the sources of the water, if a water utility has their own water rights or not, and if you have access to that source, if you will. Then the next one is the treatment of that water from the source to get it to the point that meets all these regulations that you have to meet to provide to the customers. Then you have a transmission system. And these are basically your large pipelines, your large pump stations, terminal storage, that would basically allow you to bring in large volume of water, then you distribute it to your customers. And then you have your distribution system that are, normal pipes in the street that, provide water to the customers. Now, one thing I didn't put on the slides, but that's also important. One of the major provision of the water is actually firefighting. That needs to be included in the design and the operation of the system. And now this is sort of full meal deal, if you will, that you have all of these components. Now, all of the utilities don't have those. Some of them, just purchase finished water from another, provider. Some of them only produce actually water, and then somebody else distributes it and all that. Now, the variety of them is whether it's a public entity or a private entity. in Oregon, most of the major water utilities are public, but there are some smaller, private utilities similar to power or telecommunication. And some are, like I mentioned earlier, it's like source to meter. But basically, they do provide service for everything, and that's what I call the full meal deal. And some are just doing the distribution. And so basically you have a larger utility or a larger producer that basically delivers finished water to your door, if you will, and then the utility from then on is responsible for distribution of the water and collection of bills. And generally these are long-term contracts that you have with your supplier. And then forms that it takes, if it's in the public arena, they're either a municipal system, or they're a water district, or they're a special districts, or they're PUDs. And these are essentially legal instruments.
Oop, hang on, Mort, I'm going to interrupt you. Just to describe what is a PUD for people who might not be familiar with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's public utility district. And in fact, we have one in the Portland area that was a Rockwood, PUD. And then these are different legal instruments, if you will, that would give certain, privileges and legal powers and to basically operate these water, systems. That some of them have bonding capability, some of them can do more than just one utility, if you will. If you want to have power and sewer added to that, you can. It's so they're, like I said, they are basically embedded and enshrined in the state law, and you have to go through a public process to establish those different systems. Then the water rates, and that's one thing that we all care about, and we look at it and we sometimes use it as sort of a basis to do comparison in terms of the value received or the health of a utility or the how well it is basically managed. The water rates, or most of the other also utility type services, are based on what's called the cost of service models. And it's a fairly simple model, and it's not easy to do because you have to take a lot of different issues to take into account. And the other thing is, I've tried to really make this as simple as possible in terms of for our discussion to just share information. And there are basically three general components in this rate model, if you will. One is the operation and the maintenance of it. Then there is a capital, which is basically the cost of borrowing bonds, or basically taking out a mortgage on your utility to do larger programs that you pay over time. And like any other good business, you need to have reserves basically in place to deal with basically unanticipated expenses or weather variations or things like that, that your revenue stream didn't quite match what your model said. So that's the basic model, because like I mentioned earlier, utilities just rely on their own revenue stream, if you will. So they are not counting on any general tax or anything like that. The other thing that the rates and utilities take into account that's important for us to understand is essentially whoever impacts the system, they pay for their fair share, if you will. So for example, when you take out a water service for a residential, what's commonly known as a system development charge, for a house, which is the size of your service, is much lower than a business that takes out a larger service, if you will, because that business has a greater impact, if you will, on that water utility. Or if you are developing in an undeveloped area that you require additional infrastructure to service that piece of land, if you will, you are responsible essentially follow the utilities standards to expand the infrastructure to supply water to your new development. And at that point, then it turns over to the utility that they would maintain it basically in perpetuity. Again, the other thing that I want to really stress, because I had to deal with that issue myself as a utility person, is the rates are a good indicator, if you will, but they really don't tell the whole story. You really need to dig deeper to see what is the health of the utility, and just the rate doesn't really tell you. So for example, if a utility has a lot of deferred maintenance and they're keeping the rates basically artificially and unreasonably low, it doesn't mean that they are better. In fact, in my mind, they are not responsible utility because you have to maintain your service, or they haven't planned for growth and the needs of the future customers. So that's, I really want to, at least one message I want to leave with you is that rates are good for comparison, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. Then capital versus O&M. There are certain activities that the utility does.
Hold on, O&M.
Okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, it's capital versus operation and maintenance of the system.
Thank you.
And the capital also gets into the maintenance, but it has a technical definition, if you will, when you talk about it. Maintenance is, for example, just regular maintenance of meters, of your pump station and things like that. If it falls under certain generally monetary requirement, it's maintenance. And then they use sort of direct rate money. And then the other thing I can also say that we used to say, all dollars don't have the same colors in water utility, meaning your operation and maintenance is dollar for dollar, meaning you collect $1 of rate and you spend $1 on your maintenance or your operation. But when you do capital program, then when you borrow money, actually your money goes further, if you will. So basically, a well-managed utility has minimal amount of deferred maintenance. For example, do they have a main replacement, program? What's the replacement cycle? Is it 100 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 75 years? Which gets into the level of service, customer, satisfaction, and the performance of the utility. Or, how often do you actually change over the water meters, if you will? Of course, that gets into, more major, components too, that if you have like a treatment plant, how often do you need to change your chlorinator or your chemical feed system, or, repair your concrete basins, which are more major, type of the projects that fall into the capital program. Then you need to have an asset management plan. Basically, every single piece of the utility you have, it requires maintenance. You have, thousands of like valves in your utility. How often do you actually exercise those? How often do you change those over? Like I mentioned, your piping system, you have to have on some sort of a reasonable replacement, cycle for things like that. That your asset management plan basically has captured all of the assets of that utility and has a plan of how to deal with that. And then there are issues around, do you do preventive maintenance? Do you do predictive maintenance? And those are all the things that goes into basically managing a utility. Then from that, you have to have, a 5 to 10 year capital, program that basically identifies what the projects are, and the mix of that are your maintenance, programs, system improvement, projects, or meeting new regulations that are coming up. And generally, new regulations that come up, they have a reasonable lead time that allow utilities to plan, design, finance, and construct new facilities that they have, to do. And then you basically annually update that. Then your more routine and minor repair or maintenance work is basically funded from your basically operating model, and you can't really use bonds for that. And there is always actually a little bit of a sort of internal discussion in utilities. Well, can we use this as a bond finance one? And generally your legal team and your finance people say no, you can't do that, it violates bond covenants and things like that. Then major work is, like I said, by and large, it's funded by selling of bonds. And then you have to have a good financial plan, basically, to schedule that and basically sell bonds to finance your capital program. And in fact, there are covenants in the bonds that you cannot do anything with those bonds except spend on capital programs. In fact, if you do, we had a sort of internal joke that there are jailable officials in a utility, that if you do that, you get into serious, problem. Now, there are some federal and state loans sometimes available, especially to smaller utilities, that they give them loans to do some of their capital, program. And now actually EPA, from what I understand now, they have expanded their program that they can help, that they can even help larger utilities under certain, condition. I'm surprised there are no questions.
Oh, I've got some coming up. A couple of people wrote some questions in.
Oh, sure, go ahead. Yeah, like I said, I want to have a
Well,
dialogue.
it's not necessarily like what you're talking about right now, but it was a question about like, what are the major differences between water designations, like how things are treated, that there's stormwater, there's wastewater, there's sewer, there's drinking water, like what are the different types of water and stuff. So I don't know if you want to take those at the end or.
Okay, let's take it. Okay, let's take that one at the end.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then again, water utilities, we are in long range, planning, and also the investment is intergenerational. For example, the system I'm most familiar with, Portland, most of the major infrastructure was done over 100 years ago. And it served the city very well for 70, 80, 90 years, if you will. So that has to be taken into account, that, for example, once you build a treatment plant, you cannot every year change that unless you have built into the plan that flexibility of expansion. You build it for what you think is your ultimate, and you allow, even if you build it, that it can be expanded easily. So I guess the point there is water infrastructure has to be planned for and constructed for long term. You cannot every year lay a pipe in a street because you said there are a few more houses on this street. So that's that's also important, and also the fact that it is intergenerational investment. A major, generally, especially as we are having aging infrastructure, major driver for rates are actual capital program too. But then again, like as I said earlier, every utility is unique. Maybe because of the configuration, the cost of the water and all of that, capital program may not be major, it's less major than their operation. But by and large, a driver for rates are the capital program.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come up in the chat.
Sure.
That pertain to this. And one of them is, can capital programs be funded without loans?
Yes, you can do that. But to my knowledge, no utility of any size can really afford it, because what that means, I mean, the analogy I can give is like whether you can afford buying a home, paying cash for it, or whether you can basically take out a loan.
Right.
So basically what that means, you can do that, but it would really drive your rates really, really high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there is nothing, physically or fiscally or legally stopping you from doing it. But from the finance and management and the rate impact to the customers, you don't want to do that.
You don't want to do that, right? So another question, thank you for that answer. Another question is, there's planning for major new housing projects along McLaughlin.
Mm-hmm.
Who would finance that? Would that be all the ratepayers or the developers? Like when you're putting in a big new capital program like that, who pays for that?
Okay, generally, and then again, I don't know all the specifics about this, project per se, but like I said earlier, if you have a new development that requires new infrastructure, it's a developer that has to pay for it. Depending on how deep it would impact the system, they may even have to pay the utility to upgrade the treatment plant, if you will. But a lot of times, utility has the capacity, because as a part of the planning, that piece of land, if you will, was in their planning horizon and plans, that this area eventually is going to be built up to certain density or certain utility, if you will, or certain use. So treatment plant might have that capacity, your transmission might have that capacity, but the new pipelines that they have to build, they have to pay for it upfront.
The developer.
If they require a new reservoir and a storage, in fact, I remember, a few times in Portland that we had to build certain storage for certain development. The developer actually built it to our standard, and then it was, turned over to us.
Okay. And then there's two more questions that have to do with like climate change and drought. And I don't know if you want to take those now or you want to take those later on.
Sure, I can take those now. I mean, obviously, weather is one of the drivers for water utilities for several reasons.
Right. So let me read the two questions because they sort of intersect. So one of them is, how do we intergenerationally plan for climate change? Right. And are there working projections for this, working projections? And the other one is, how would continued drought and decreased snowpack in the Northwest affect the capital needs of water providers? So those sort of linked together in that way.
Yeah. Okay. Couple of things that I can share based on what I know is essentially water utilities are very sensitive to weather. And they sort of get hit at both ends, at the supply side of it, also at the demand side of it, because the revenue for them comes from selling water. So if your assumption was, we are going to sell, certain amount, and it didn't happen, obviously you have a shortage. That's why you have that reserves. In fact, one of the reasons for the reserves is essentially to allow for weather variations. Now, this was pre-climate change regime, if you will. Now, the other thing that's happening is, which I'm sure people are doing it, I haven't seen it, which doesn't mean it's not there, is what's also happening, a lot of the systems are designed based on certain statistical sort of weather performance, climatological information from past. For example, even on larger systems that you have a dam, or you have a storage, or you have a certain river flow and all of that, is based on 50, 75, 100 years of data. And then based on that, you basically design your system, if you will. Now we are in a new era, and we have to adjust all of those things. Now, in terms of those intergenerational stuff, there might be some adjustment made. I mean, I'll just give you an illustration, because a lot of times your system has to supply what's called your peak demand, which is very different than your average demand. For example, your winter demand, I'm making up the number now, might be 10 million gallons a day for certain utility. But during peak water demand, it could be 2.5 or 3 times that amount. So you want to be able to provide water at any given time. Now, if your water budget, which is the availability of your water, if you will, is changing, therefore you need to make adjustments, or you need to make modifications to your system to meet that. Then you also have to work both from the supply side of it to better understand what the new regime is, also work on the demand side of it. Are there things you can do with conservation, if you will, that would still give you the service, all the water you need, but you can maybe use less water more efficiently to meet that? So that, to me, it's a little bit of a new area, or newer area, that utilities have to deal with. But like I said, what I can tell you, the design of those systems now are different. For example, we did actually this study before climate change was even really popular as it is. It was over 20, 25 years ago. Mark probably remembers too. We had actually somebody at University of Washington did a climate study for us. And what we find, which is actually surprisingly accurate, because it hasn't been reputed so far that I've seen, said the amount of water we get in boron watershed is essentially the same. But rather than getting spread over 6 or 7 months, it would come in less number of storms, if you will. So you have basically more spillage, and basically you have to figure out how to manage your system now, because you won't have the same water budget as you did before. Even though you got the same amount of rain, but because it wasn't spread over a period of time, you were actually could be potentially water short. So it's something that has to be dealt with, and I'm sure utilities are looking at it and studying it. And like I said, it's a major issue. And the larger the utility you are, the bigger impact it's going to have. So you have to have a diversity of your sources, and maybe the areas that were relying totally on surface water may have to have, potentially some groundwater sources as a backup or supplemental. I don't know if I answered all the components. Oh yeah, you had actually, let me answer the water, question.
Mhm.
Okay, go ahead, Eleanor.
No, it was that the talk about the different types of designations and
Right,
stuff.
right.
So it's talking about that there's drinking water, sewage, stormwater, wastewater, just to help people get, and,
Right.
and are you done with the slides? I didn't want to interrupt.
No, I can finish it later.
Okay,
Jan, let me actually take Jan.
because I also
Jan,
think
like I said,
no, but while you're talking, it would be lovely to see you rather than the slide. If it's not too much
Oh,
trouble
okay.
to go back and forth. I was just thinking, we're missing you talking about this stuff.
Oh,
So-
okay. All right. Okay. So let me finish the slides. I get back.
Okay.
Um,
And we have about another 20 minutes or so. So just
Okay.
to think about that.
All right. Okay. So I think I'm pretty much with this. I mean, I've talked about the capital program,
Mhm.
that, you need to have a plan. And the other thing, actually, I want to sort of maybe, plug in here.
Mhm.
It's people shouldn't really focus on the rates by itself. We need to understand what they do for us.
Mhm.
Because in reality, when you finance a capital program and you sell bonds, essentially you get rated by a rating agency. And these guys dig into everything to see how well that utility is managed. And the better it's managed, the lower your rates. So therefore, it behooves you to make sure you are having a well-managed and well-run utility, because it actually saves you money. Okay, that was it. So, okay, let me just then stop this maybe.
Great. If we could stop this and cut back to your lovely self.
Okay.
That would be-
You're
I'm serious. Yeah,
fine.
that would be good.
Okay, now let me see. Let me see if I can. All right, let's see.
That'd be great.
Okay. I guess I was only 50% successful. I know how to share. Oh, there we go. Stop. Okay.
There we
I
go.
gotta be able
Great.
to read.
Okay, so thank you so much for that. And again, here's this question again of what are the major differences in the water designations and treatments?
Okay.
Drinking water, those sort of things. Mhm.
Okay. Okay. So the kind of water we have, and there are even a couple of more, but that's not in there. One is drinking water. And drinking water generally just comes from either surface water, a stream, lake, or groundwater. And then depending on the quality of it, it has different kind of treatment that you have to meet EPA and state regulations. And it's very high, and we probably have some of the highest standards in the world in terms of the water quality. So that's the drinking water. That's when you open the kitchen tap, if you will. Then you have sewer. And then sewer is basically the waste, from homes or waste from a business that has to go. And some of the businesses actually have to do their own on-site treatment before they discharge into the sewer. So that's like solid waste, what goes down the toilet, if you will. So that's the sewer water, if you will. Then there is a stormwater, if you will. And in the past, stormwaters were either combined with the sewer that would go out to treatment or gets discharged. And quite frankly, as a country, we didn't do a good job separating those two things. We were in a hurry to develop, and we were not as careful with the environment. So we had what we call sewer overflows, that you actually had not only the rainwater that basically comes down on a street or a lawn that gets collected, and now those two are essentially separated in most places. In fact, that was a big project that city of Portland did. They call it the big pipe. It was like 1.2 1.3 billion dollars a few years ago, that actually separate the sewer that's basically waste versus the stormwater, if you will. Now, we have gotten smart now. We realize rather than collecting that and having some sort of a treatment, whether it would be passive treatment or whether it would be a sophisticated, heavy treatment, because the waste that comes from homes, it goes through a treatment plant also that takes out all the solid, that takes out the pathogens, that basically brings it to a level that's safe enough that can be discharged into a body of water. I mean, for example, Willamette River is a source of accepting sewage effluent, actually. So that's also that part of it. Now, stormwater, we got smarter and we realized we may not have to collect and create a big, huge system. Maybe there are things that we can do to do on-site treatment, to build, you probably see it around parkings and things like that, that they call it bioswales. That, for example, the runoff from a parking, rather than going into a centralized system, it goes into a piece of land that has basically permeable soil with some gravel on the top or rocks on the top, and with some plants that basically the plants would basically cleanse and clarify that water and all of that. So the stormwater is essentially the water generated from precipitation, whether it would be a snow or rain, if you will. Now, there are sort of variations of some of these things. I don't think in Oregon we have done a lot of it, but you see it in California, or things around what they call gray water. That they use that gray water, that's, for example, maybe the water that comes from the bath or comes from kitchen, that it is not as polluted as sewer water, that you can maybe use that actually to basically irrigate your plants or your lawns and things like that.
So here are two more questions, because there's a bunch of questions that have come in, and I'm going to sort of combine two of them. One of them is, are there any places that turn wastewater into drinking water? And that's that same idea of, do you anticipate water providers in the region will need to begin a program of using reclaimed water for non-potable uses? So one of them is saying non-potable uses and drinking water. So.
Okay, the answer is yes. And there are actually major utilities in the US that are doing that, actually. The one that readily comes to my mind is San Diego. I'm sure Mark has the whole list. That they use it, and they use it in two ways. I mean, obviously one big issue with that, quite frankly, is public acceptance. It just, I mean, even though the astronauts have been doing it for 50 years, we on Earth still are not ready to.
It's like eating insects. Do you really see them as a source of protein?
Right.
Okay, and we've got just about 10 more minutes left, and there's an issue that comes together that I wanted to talk about this. So one thing is, again, this presentation is being done for the Oak Lodge Governance Project, and in the study that we've commissioned, I'm going to read this. It leaves the current sanitary district, the water and sanitary district, intact under all the three scenarios that are being looked at in this project. So currently, the Oak Lodge Water and Sanitary District is seeking authority status right now, so that if and when our local governance changes, they would remain, protected and as is. Right. The only water service that's being modeled differently in this research grant is that the Oak Lodge folks especially need to understand is the issue of stormwater. So watershed protection falls under the OLWSD and would remain the same, but the stormwater management infrastructure and capital improvement falls to the county in this currently unincorporated area. So the county spends almost nothing on this in our area. And the city of Milwaukee spends a lot and has separate fees to the residents in Milwaukee for stormwater. So part of it is to really understand more thoroughly what happens for stormwater infrastructure in this particular area. So that's one concept of understanding. Then there's this other question that's come in from Mark, actually. Mark, I hope that's okay. Well, it was to everyone, so everybody knows. It's that in this list of governance models, he didn't notice a water authority model. And so maybe we could hear the difference between what's an authority and what's a district, and how those two options would be affected by annexation. So,
Okay.
because one of the thoughts is that the study is showing, this area stays the same,
Right.
which basically, watershed protection by the service district and pretty much no stormwater infrastructure being put into place by the county. Or this area may, parts of it may, we don't have any idea, but the study is what would happen if this area annexed into the city of Milwaukee, which is putting a lot of investment into stormwater. Or what would happen if this area incorporates on its own and would want to put in stormwater. So that's one of the big things we're
Right.
looking at right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, take the water authority. I just forgot to put it under Mark. Then to the specific of that, I mean, any of these models would really work. I mean, you can have a municipal service, that's the full meal deal. You can have an authority within the city that would work. You could have a PUD, because in fact, we have all of these just around us in the metro area. The issues are, what are the arrangements and what are the long-term plans, and how do you integrate all of that and make sure there is accountability and service, if you will. So, I mean, that's the main thing. Now, in terms of, for example, I don't know enough to really opine when we say county is not spending any money. Is it they have really forgotten, or they have really done such a good job 5 years ago that they don't need to spend any money now? Like I said, I mean, I don't know that specific to tell you, but the thing is, you need to ask the right question and really get to the bottom of it, because some of these things really does not preclude the flexibility that you need to have to move with your project forward. Because at the end of the day, no matter what you call it, I mean, I can almost say with very high certainty, Clackamas water is going to be your water source. None of your infrastructure is going to go away. If the arrangement and governance, changes, and that happens actually a lot. I mean, I remember actually even, within my time with City of Portland, a lot of the smaller water districts were actually annexed into the city, either when the annexation happened, or that made sense for them because they were small enough and they couldn't really maintain the system. So that's what worked best. So the form that it will take, I don't think it would preclude any type of arrangement that the community decides, to have. So like I said, this thing, you really have to dig into it to understand. When you say county doesn't spend anything, what does that really mean? Does that mean the streets are getting flooded now because they're not managing it? Are they violating a law or not? Because like I said, these are all regulated.
My sense is, and I don't want to go too far down this chicken road, but my sense is that this area has densified, sort of abruptly in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years. And the infrastructure that isn't really what the county's been up to and focused on. So that we're sort of, the issue of stormwater has become more important to recognize. And it's sort of a gap right now. I mean, Kevin, Mark, do you have other thoughts on that? I mean, is that sort of the general, consensus?
Well,
Kevin?
I'll go first, I guess. My opinion, having been a street guy for many years at the city of Portland and a sewer guy, I think that what the county has decided is that they have higher priorities than dealing with stormwater issues in our neighborhood. We've had some agreements with them in the past where we have agreed that we would take care of some things and they would do some things for us in exchange, some street sweeping and things like that. But, unfortunately, the infrastructure has not kept up with what it needs to be for stormwater conveyance. And actually, there's really nowhere to convey it other than natural things like the Boardman Creek wetlands or places like that. So we have a lot of temporary storage places where stormwater is going. But you know, my opinion is the county consistently says that we own the stormwater problem, but the fact is we've done enough legal analysis and study to know that it actually is theirs to do. They choose not to do it at this point.
Let me just quickly add, and obviously I agree with everything Kevin said, because he's always right. He tells me that regularly. No, but the fact is, it also speaks to exactly what Mort was saying earlier about the importance of capital planning. And one of the problems that we have in this area is because of this division of responsibilities between the county and the services district, nobody really has that vision in terms of how we deal with asset management and long-term capital plans and how are we going to finance it. And so all those pieces are frankly broken at this point. And so what you see is the net effect of a really disjointed approach to managing the stormwater system. And that means that we've got pipes that don't have adequate capacity. We've got pipes that aren't properly maintained. And what's happening is you got fingers pointing at each other saying, that's your responsibility. You know, it's a goofy way to run this part of the operation.
Well, we do have a permit, a municipal separated storm sewer system permit issued by DEQ jointly to the county and the service district, but it's kind of dumped into those two parties' laps as how they want to divide the responsibilities. And the county, of course, doesn't have the funds to do the things that should be done. So,
yep, exactly. So we have just a few more moments until we normally close at 1. And there have been 2 questions that have come in that are similar to concerns about seismic activity. And what happens for, you know, how do water providers plan for and make improvements needed for seismic resiliency? And there was a similar question of, you know, if there's a big earthquake, basically, let's see, it was, let me get this, if a Cascadia fault moves, in terms, how would the repairs be covered or paid for? Are there state plans? So there's sort of 2 questions about seismic resiliency and what would happen and who would pay for it. So,
well, what I can say, and then Mark is gonna, you know, tell us how they are doing it, is essentially utilities have to have what I call a vulnerability assessment study done, and essentially identify, and obviously seismic is one. And I don't know this, but I'm pretty sure, you know, Oak Lodge has at least looked at their major, you know, facilities of how to deal with it. And who pays for it is, at the end of the day, we are going to pay for it. Even if it's tax money, it's our money. Mark.
All correct. And the other sort of wrinkle to it is, you know, in 2013, the state generated what was called the Oregon Resilience Plan. And basically that created the incentive for water utilities to do a seismic assessment when they do a water master plan. And so the water master plan is really a key part to this whole capital planning process. And that identifies what improvements are needed to deal with the highest priority seismic upgrades. And that then gets folded into the master plan, that gets folded into the financial plan, that then takes the course that Mort outlined for us. And so you know, it's all part of that long-term capital plan and the financial plan to figure out how to pay for those improvements.
Great. Well, that takes us right up to 1 o'clock. And Mort, is there anything else you want to say? I know one question was, what would you say, you're speaking earlier about the uniqueness, you know, of each water system, and just sort of as a summary, what would you say is unique about, you know, this system or this area, or you sort of take that as largely as you like. What do you see?
Well, I mean, just a couple of things comes to my mind is you think about your source and treatment. It's a joint water, you know, what I call joint water commission, if you will. So that's, you know, one uniqueness, that you have several other partners essentially controlling treatment and provision of service. So how those agreements and stuff are made are really important. The other thing is the growth that you have had over the last few years after a very stable, population. The other one could be the mix of the customers of the district, if you will. That probably most of them are residential, and you have maybe less commercial and industrial, if you will. And the other one is, most of the water is pumped. Whereas, other system, you have more gravity, if you will. So, there are some of the things that come to my mind.
Mark, Kevin, Paul, any last comments or anything?
I'll
Well,
defer to
for
Mark or
those,
Paul.
for those that don't know, as Mort pointed out, the North Clackamas County Water Commission, Oak Lodge does not make its own water. They are part owners of the North Clackamas County Water Commission that is a water wholesaler jointly with, we own like 43% of the plant. Sunrise Water owns 46% and City of Gladstone 10%. So I just wanted to point that out in case, for those who might not know that.
Right.
The thing I would add, but it all is in the same context, is the sort of the regional cooperation that exists, not just in terms of ownership of the supply, but Oak Lodge is part of what's called the Regional Water Providers Consortium, which includes 23 of the water providers throughout the region. So when you hear water conservation messages during the summer on the radio or the TV spots on Channel 2, those are all coordinated by all of the water providers working together to create a shared message. Since we're one media market, we all work together to provide that kind of information, because it wouldn't make a lot of sense for Lake Oswego to be providing one message, Oak Lodge providing a different message, and Portland providing a different message. So through this consortium of the 23 water providers, we all work together. We also then are able to plan some of the sort of regional infrastructure improvements. There's a product called the Regional Water Supply Plan. And we do the same thing for emergency planning as well, in terms of emergency provision of water. So this regional partnership extends not just in our local area, but clear on the other side of the West Hills, and clear, north. And so it's a very powerful tool that benefits the entire region.
And we should probably also give a shout out to all the regional water providers for the great work that was done in 2020 during the fires. We were very, very close to being out of water at some of our plants. And the way we shifted stuff around and pumping things uphill, downhill, hither and yon, made it so that nobody had to turn on their tap and find that nothing was coming out.
So I want to be respectful of time and of everybody's, the rest of the afternoon. But I think for people who aren't familiar with the folks who are on the conversation, Mark, Kevin, and Paul, if you'd be kind enough to state what your titles are, so people who aren't familiar, like watching this, are saying, well, who are those guys, and why are they answering these questions? So Paul, perhaps you could start, and then Kevin, and then Mark.
I'm the current president of the Oak Lodge Water Services District Board of Directors.
Lovely, thank you. And Kevin?
I'm a director on the board of directors of Oak Lodge Water Services.
Great. And Mark?
And I am also a director. I'm currently the treasurer on the board of Oak Lodge, and have the unique experience of also serving as the CEO of the Tualatin Valley Water District and chief engineer for the Tualatin Valley Water District for about 12 years. And before that, 20 years of working side by side and under Mort at the Portland Water Bureau. Great.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here. And we hope to see you next month. And again, thanks for everyone's participation, and have a lovely rest of your Saturday.